Hi, welcome to the open space with Aura. If you like what you hear and see on this channel, please click subscribe button. I have some fascinating guests tonight. I don't know where the conversation will take us. As I always say, it's an impromptu, but it's going to be around what we all passionately love and the subject of music. And in my youth years, I was obsessed with German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And one of the Nietzsche's quotes, my obsession is long gone, obsession with Nietzsche. But the quote I carry with me, and I can put my signature under every single word. Nietzsche once said that without music, life would be a mistake. And I deeply feel the words, I deeply feel what he means. He means many things and nothing in particular. And I have a sense that certain things about music that it creates for us human beings, for me specifically, such as creates magical realm and gives me the tremendous sense of mystery and fascinating play, which I deeply engage with, that makes me forget everything else and yet wake up to something greater than myself through this play, because I'm a musician and I'm performing musician. And for me, music is inseparable from physical process of playing. It seems that society these days try to attach certain unneeded strings to this magical, playful, spiritually uplifting, and many other things realm of music. And my two guests today, Bruno Chaouat and Dr. Timothy Jackson, Dr. Chaouat, which I would love you to introduce yourself briefly to our listeners. I would like to invite you to this conversation on what music means to you and what is about to be lost about the very magic that music creates around us. Or maybe I'm wrong. Usually I'm wrong, at least partially. Please, Timothy, introduce yourself.
My name is Timothy Jackson. I'm a professor of music theory at University of North Texas. For many years, I've been teaching a special type of music theory called Shankerian analysis that was developed by the Austrian Jewish music theorist Heinrich Shanker. I studied with a number of students of Shanker, so I have a direct connection with Shanker actually through two different teaching lines. And before I became interested in Shankerian analysis at the age of 20, I had, of course, played classical music as a child, starting with the age 7. My early education was essentially as a pianist, although I always wanted to be a composer. And somewhere along the line, I realized that my compositional gifts were not up to scratch, let's say. I wasn't truly great. I didn't have a truly original voice, but I found that I have a special gift for elucidating and explaining the work of the great masters, and especially using the Shankerian methodology to do it. And that's where I found my métier and to a certain degree my niche. And that's what I've been doing for the past, I would say 43 years of teaching and studying music.
Beautiful. Bruno, few words about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm an outsider here because I'm not a musician except a musician amateur. But
Amateur means lover of music,
that's
right?
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm a scholar in literature and French literature in particular. I've been working on French, thought, 20th century in particular, French thought and literature for many years now. And my relation to music is mainly amateurish, but also existential, meaning that, as you said in the beginning, quoting Nietzsche, I can't really imagine a life without music. And you were talking about strings attached. I like the metaphor in the beginning, in your introduction. And in a way, I would say that doing music, I play the piano as an amateur again, and listening to music is a way of getting rid of those strings, but those strings are difficult to define. I would say that perhaps they have to do with discourse, with language. Perhaps they have to do with politics and ideology. And for me, music is a way of escaping those realms of discourse. And I discovered a long time ago, but I reread recently the beautiful book by Vladimir Jankelevich, the French Jewish philosopher, who was one of the rare, you mentioned Nietzsche, of the rare philosophers who engaged in a very concrete way with the musical thing. And
along with Roland Barthes, of course.
Yes, yes. And Jankelevich talked about music as the ineffable, as something that can't really be narrated into or put into words. And I may be wrong again, but this is my relation to music is a relation to a form of silence, i.e. not silence because there is no sound, obviously, but silence because the words finally, the world of language is finally quiet and still.
So music, in other words, take you out of the noise of everything else.
I would put it this way.
Beautiful.
Maybe I could jump in here and say that there have always been some strings attached to music, but the strings change over time. And what remains, I think, is the core of the music itself. In other words, to take a concrete example, Handel's oratorios, especially his oratorios on biblical subjects. So in the historical context, they did have social and political connotations. The British saw themselves as analogous to the Israelites and their battles with peoples around them. So let's say the warlike aspects of the ancient Israelites were seen as a kind of parallelism to English conflicts with their neighbors and eventually their imperial aspirations were in fact connected with some of Handel's music. But at the core of Handel's music is something else. And it's much more directly related to what Bruno and you, Aura, have been talking about, which is this timeless and string-free element in the music as well. And that element, I think, is the driving force of all music and all truly great music that can transcend time and place and still move people today. People who have no understanding or interest in the contemporary significance of the music, but can appreciate its inner essence, so to speak, you see. And that's true of all, I would say, of all music. You can take away the outer strings, as it were, and if the music has real integrity and coherence and depth of purpose, which of course Handel's music has, then it can still speak to people today without any need to refer to its contemporary context. So it's a complicated thing. All music does have contemporary resonances. It has its place in the history of civilization, and it's connected with contemporary events to its composition. But I would say that the determining aspect of whether a music will be of lasting value and of lasting significance depends on its internal organization, on its internal coherence and integrity of thought. And those are things which transcend time and place in a certain sense.
Right. And Bruno mentioned discourse, and I can add that music that integrity comes from maybe perhaps music's own self-referentiality, where music becomes a discourse within itself, regardless of external context.
Right.
Yes, I was thinking in particular about the lyrical, non-language, wordless, so to speak, music. That is a music that is not indeed at the service, as it were, of a plot or a narrative. And with this music, I understand very well that there remains a form of narrative and there remains some form of certain standards and rules of a certain period of time that marks the music as not entirely transhistorical and in a way conjunctural and related to a certain period of time. If you listen to the music of Lully, for example, you're going immediately to hear some sort of glory and triumph of the French monarchy of Louis XIV. But nonetheless, I think that there is a music without a purpose, ideological, narratological, or political. And this is the music that I'm most interested in. It is the music that is very enigmatic in a way, because as Ora was saying, it is self-referential. That is, it builds a system of sounds, a system of harmonies, of chords that are self-sufficient and autonomous in a way, and that yes, there are some codes in classical music, there are codes in Baroque music, there are codes in romantic music, and even in 12-tone and more modern music.
And in jazz as well.
And in jazz as well. But nonetheless, there is something in the composition in music that perhaps it's the integrity you're talking about, Tim, and perhaps you could go back to this concept of integrity, and you talked about coherence or consistency as well. And that actually really transcends a moment in history. One way of looking at it is to look at some very bizarre choices by filmmakers of certain soundtrack and music when they use music well and when they use classical. And they can actually use a piece of music that's supposed to be, representative of some period of time or some mood even, and completely distort it to the point that it's going to correspond to a plot or to a story on the screen, which is entirely divorced and separated from this music. I find the fact that music can be heard so diversely absolutely astonishing. And about integrity, I wanted to ask Tim, because I have you here on my screen, what exactly you mean by integrity, and how do we recognize, or how you as a music critic and scholar, do you recognize or discriminate or distinguish between a music that has this integrity and that self-coherence, and a music that, according to you, does not have that? Are there some criteria out there to distinguish that, or?
So you've asked, I think, a number of interrelated questions. First of all, I would say that a lot of the truly great composers and masters of the past, although they worked very often to commission, that was not always the case. So I'd like to take one interesting example. There was a composer by the name of Franz Krommer, who was a contemporary of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote his last symphony, his Symphony Number 9, without any performance possibility in mind or offered. In other words, it wasn't commissioned. He was a well-known musician, very highly regarded in Vienna at the time, but there was no external stimulus to write the piece. It's just something that he wanted to produce. And I think that we have to understand that even though a lot of composers of the past were in fact commissioned to write pieces of music, they did so in a way that combined external with internal impulses. So there was something that they wanted to express, and they negotiated a way to express their inner compulsions, their inner drive to do something, to say something in their music with external stimuli, right? Whether it was a commission or whatever opportunity came their way, right? So let's say Lully was patronized by Louis XIV, but there was still something in Lully that transcended his time and place that he wanted to express through his music. It wasn't simply to glorify the king. There's something else in his music which transcends that relationship and that, let's say, that external stimulus. And it's that very internal thing, that impulse, that internal impulse that's also connected with the internal integrity of the musical structure as a musical structure that's divorced from any external stimuli, all right? And what Shankerian analysis does, which I think is so wonderful, is that it allows us to understand all the different structural levels in a piece of music and how they interrelate one to the other. That also enables us to see motivic connections between the surface of the music and the deeper structural levels, so that they all collaborate to produce a desired idea. In other words, the music doesn't exist just for the sake of sounding forth. It exists, there is something behind that, an idea in the ideal sense of the word, a real idea which is behind that. Now, Louis XIV may have liked the external sound of the music. He may have felt that it was a good background sound for, or a soundtrack for the kind of pomp and circumstance that he wanted to project in his court. And Lully's style suited that need. So the king, of course, was happy to promote his music. But what I'm saying is that there's an inner impulse to Lully that informs his music, that contributes to its coherence, that contributes to its motivic life, and gives it a very special integrity. And that's what I'm talking about when I use that word, integrity.
And comparatively, I can bring out great masters like Michelangelo, Titian, who were of course commissioned by the church, right? And we can argue, yes, they did frescoes by being commissioned by the church, and yet it was a manifestation of inner impulse in a visual art or in sculpture. But Tim and Bruno, I wanted to ask, Bruno, I wanted to say something. Yeah.
Well, to follow up maybe, but don't forget your question then.
Regarding Shanker, it seems to me, I might be wrong because I know very little about Shanker, but it seems to me that he really got into nuts and bolts of inner architecture of music, of let's say blueprint and supporting beams that supports music from within before it springs itself out there.
That's true. And he also, once you understand those principles and how they work, then you can understand how music is self-referential, because it can either conform to certain norms of structural generation, or in a sense resist those norms and press against them. And that becomes part of a purely musical, you could say, a narrative, but it's not a narrative that we can put into words, that we can translate into words. It's a purely musical narrative.
And what bothers me lately, that music has, of course, it's as an architectural form, it has hierarchies of different harmonies, right, and progressions. But again, it's self-referential. It is within music. You cannot compare it to, let's say, societal hierarchies or patriarchies or whatever. And it bothers me lately that political language, again, we come to language, is mixed up with purely aesthetical language of music, inner structure.
The argument is that there is no such thing as pure aesthetic, right? For the critiques of, let's say, of classical music or certain type of analysis of music, there is no such thing as innocence in a way. And what we are striving for, maybe the three of us here, is a form of innocence in listening and in playing music. And that's something that we strive for, that we really need. I think that I need, at least. And the question I had also for Tim is that what you were talking about, when you talk about this idea that is the sort of foundation of the composition in classical in particular, I draw an analogy with the Renaissance concept in visual arts of the designo, where you have also a sort of a concept of the dessin, you know, in French, that means the drawing, so to speak, and the design at the same time, the same word, right? Dessin, design, drawing. And that you have this sort of idea that precedes, so to speak, the realization, the materialization of the sensible, sensual, aesthetic object. And so the question I have is, do you have in mind, when you talk about this consistency and coherence and integrity, only a form of music or genre of music that responds to this idealization, pre-realization in a way, or pre-writing, that's as though there was something in the mind, if you will, of the creator that was going to be put and projected onto the paper and onto the piano and onto the instrument? Or is it possible to have a more improvisational form of music? And Ori, what you were discussing, jazz, you were mentioning jazz, and you could mention lots of other genres of music that are much more improvisational, not notated, for example, unwritten. is it something that is possible as well to have integrity, to have consistency, even though you don't have this sort of design or design or concept, if you will?
Well, if I might answer that, the classical masters in particular, starting with C.P. Bach, even addressed this issue of improvisation. And in fact, what they said was that you have to have a basic idea in your mind first, and then that serves as the basis for an improvisational filling out of the idea or realization of the idea. So I believe that even if they were improvising, the masters of the past, the classical masters in particular, but also the 19th century masters and 20th century masters, always had some kind of basic plan in mind before they sat down to improvise. And also I would add that in the 18th century and earlier actually, that there wasn't a clear distinction between strict composition and improvisation. In fact, very often, concerts might even include some kind of improvisation by the composer. There were even competitions, quote unquote, where composers competed to improvise. So all of them were capable of improvising, but they all had a basic idea in mind. And I think that's also true for jazz musicians, that they have, let's say, a song melody or a chord progression or something in their minds before they put their hands to the keyboard and improvise, because it's the same process, really.
Yeah.
So in other words, I'm not sure that there really is any distinction between improvisation per se and formal composition. It's really the same process. I think a lot of compositions are simply written out improvisations, and you can see that and hear that in the music itself. There's often an improvisatory character to at least certain passages in many famous works.
And it's a known fact that a lot of jazz musicians have deep affinity to J.S. Bach, specifically for this reason, because it's hard to differentiate where improvisation starts and plan ends. I call it always a well-planned spontaneity. There is always a plan, and then you start building upon it, and that's the beauty.
The way that we know that Bach taught by, he would ask the student to play something, a chorale, let's say on the organ. And the way he taught composition was that he would improvise voices around what the student was playing. So he would stand next to the student at the organ and play counter melodies to what the student was playing. And that was how they learned the techniques of composition.
Kind of like a jam session, right?
Exactly.
So the question, another question I have, which I guess follows up from this discussion, is the question of hierarchies. And Ora, you have evoked this problem of hierarchies, and you've talked about how we cannot. There is an internal hierarchy, but this hierarchy is not translatable into politics or into social hierarchies and so on. So the question I would have is, do you think that there is a possibility of building or establishing a kind of hierarchy among different forms of music? It's a huge question that I encounter with my students, and I have for 20 years, if not more now, of the judgment of taste, so to speak. In other words, how do we come up with a judgment based on quality, or what we think is the quality of a piece of literature, a piece of painting, a piece of art, without being in a way spoken by a certain ideology. And I've had this question coming up again like a couple of weeks ago with one of my students in a literature course, asking how do you know that this painting is good but this other one is bad? How do you know that this piece of this novel is good and that one is not good? And it's very difficult to, it's not like I have an answer. I think it's an extremely difficult question. Sometimes I just find an expediency and say, well, it's a matter of the experience of the professor, the experience of the scholar, the experience of the musician, the experience of the artist, who is going to tell you, because I have been in deep contact with music for such a long period of time, I can say that this music is superior to the other music. Should we, it's very difficult in a democratic classroom, in an egalitarian, politically egalitarian society, to mention even the idea that there are forms in art, in literature, and even in philosophy or in thought that are superior to other forms. What do you think of that? How do you grapple with that, if you have to, in your own experience?
So this is a very difficult question, which involves, I think, many, many questions, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But let me say this, that in music, there are certain rules, quote unquote. There are more principles, really. But musicians are taught, let's say from an early age, don't do this, don't do this, do this. There's a lot of such rules and prescriptions, and the music theorists of the past have, had dialogues with teacher and student, where the student does something and the teacher says, don't do that, but do this instead. So I found that when I look at great composers, quote unquote, like Mozart, for example, well, Mozart tends to be very strict about some of these rules. And he also could be a very foul-mouthed person. He could be quite vile in terms of his criticism. And he had a student by the name of Süssmayr. Now, Süssmayr is famous today because he completed Mozart's Requiem, right? And his completion, although remarkably good in certain ways, is filled with, quote unquote, errors, all right, that Mozart would never have allowed. So Brahms actually published Süssmayr's completion, and in the foreword he says something quite interesting. He says that everything that appears in this completion by Süssmayr might be questionable, but I felt that my role as editor was not to change what Süssmayr had written in his devotion to his teacher and at that time, but simply to publish it as it is in the manuscript and let the reader or musician decide whether it's good or not. Okay, so this is one aspect. So one of the things I've found, you were talking about experience. One of the things that I found in composers who are generally regarded as less good than, let's say, the top echelon of composers in our tradition, in classical tradition, they do have these errors, quote unquote, in their writing. In other words, there are things there that you would not generally find in, let's say, the truly top people, the top composers. Although you'd be surprised, there are things in Bach and Mozart that one might question, all right? And in fact, Brahms made a collection of those things, and Shanker actually published Brahms' collection with a commentary about them. In other words, even the greatest masters allowed these certain errors or violation of certain principles to creep into their music, right? So, and there are reasons why maybe they allowed these things, but they're still the great exception. One should not exaggerate them. And I found that when I look at second-rate or third-rate Renaissance composers, I see things in their music that I wouldn't see in a top-rate composer like Josquin, all right? From the same period. In other words, you see certain kinds of features, technical features in the music which show a certain lack of sophistication. And the same is true in Mozart's time, all right? And the same is true later. I've looked at a lot of music, and I've looked at so-called second-rate and third-rate composers. So on the most basic level of technique, they very often are in fact deficient, quote unquote.
So here you're talking about internal comparisons among, let's say, Baroque or classical or romantic composers. What about comparing outside of the realm of the classical, the very coded, in a way, music? You can say it's very coded, even if there is always a kind of subversion of the code by the very best ones, I would think, or an invention based on a sort of deviation from this code. I wonder if you would be willing to engage in comparison with different genres. And I'm thinking of pop, popular music, I'm thinking of folk, I'm thinking of, today there is lots of debate about introducing, for example, rap into curricula of music. So I wonder if it's possible, in your opinion, to make distinctions, or let's say make an argument that would be very politically incorrect argument that, let's say, no, you know, Beethoven, it's actually superior to Beyonce or to a pop singer. I don't really know them, but or let's say it's superior to rap. How would you begin? And it's a question for Ora as well, as a performer of music. How would you begin to argue about it? Is it even desirable to argue about it? Is it too fraught? Is it too political? Or are there ways that we could enter into a discussion about it that would be that would have integrity and honesty?
I can answer quickly and let Tim to provide more elaborated answer, if you allow me. I would bring some ridiculous comparison. For me, there's always place for everything under the sun. The question of a taste, and the comparison I will bring is the following. You can go to sophisticated gourmet restaurant for tremendously detailed, nuanced cuisine, let's say French cuisine, and have served an amazing dish, tastefully served, very nuanced, with a lot of subtle, well-balanced ingredients. At the same time, if you're hungry, you can go through drive-through and buy yourself a sandwich in Subway or something, and it will satiate your hunger, right? You're satisfied and you keep going. Do we need both? I would say yes, we need both. The purpose is different. So that will be my short answer.
Yeah, the question is, do we need both at the university? Do we need both in an institution whose mission is to expose students to what we think is the most refined and sophisticated? That's the question.
Yes, we need, because we need full exposure. Here is this, and here is why we think it's gourmet. And here is this, and that's why we think it's probably good enough but it's more of a subway quality, but we need both. We need full exposure.
Hmm.
That's what I think.
Yeah, but the full exposure you can have outside of the institution. In other words, do you need to go to the culinary school to learn how to grill your hamburger or to what you know, or can you do it like at home, you know, like folk cuisine, so which is great, you know, and same thing in a way. But and my question is not really a tricky, I mean, it's not a trick or anything like that, because I do believe that there are levels of extreme complexity and refinement in I don't know about pop, but certainly in rap, I think it's possible. And maybe Tim will disagree. I would like to hear you on that. Or heavy metal. My son is a heavy metal musician and composer, and he is convinced, and he can demonstrate, like Tim, you can demonstrate the complexity with Shanker theory about, you know, he can demonstrate to me why the harmonies of this particular piece of heavy metal are absolutely incredible and complex, and so on and so forth. So my question is that, you know, is how do we figure out what is the music that should enter into a curriculum, should be considered as worthy of thinking about, writing about, and learning about?
So can I attempt a little bit of an answer to that? I've had some students who were very good musicians in my classes, my counterpoint classes over the years, but they were pop musicians, they were jazz musicians mainly, who were very, very gifted, because the school that I teach at is well known for its jazz program. And one day I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I grew up, and I was walking down the street and I heard a and a car stopped suddenly beside me, and the door opened, and out stepped one of my former students who was a jazz musician and who happened to be in Halifax for a jazz festival. And he just came and hugged me and said that I was the greatest counterpoint teacher he'd ever had, and that he learned so much from my classes, that it gave him the foundation that he needed for jazz. Now, one thing I would say is that the advantage of teaching complicated music like classical music is that you're not lowering your standards, you're not catering to the lowest common denominator. On the contrary, you're teaching people very complicated techniques, and that if they want to apply them to pop music, which is simpler in many ways than classical music, then they're well trained. It doesn't work the other way, though, you see. That's why I would argue that while it would be good to, and I'm not opposed to teaching popular music. I think that would be regressive. But what I'm saying is that the advantage of teaching a highly complicated musical language like classical music is that you can then apply all those techniques to popular music and really have a core of competencies that will enable you to let's say open a fast food shop, but also a high gourmet restaurant at the same time, you see. But it doesn't work both ways. If you learn only to do the fast food, then you never will reach the gourmet level.
I agree. And in literature, it's in a way it's the same thing. You can go from Proust to a TV show, you know, in terms of analyzing and so on, but you cannot really go from the, if you've been fed only with the TV show, it's very difficult to go then to the very complex sentence of Racine or Proust or Shakespeare and so on. So I agree with you. It works in one direction, not in the other. Okay.
And that's why it's crucially important to introduce and to get into very inner workings of most complex works of art, whether in music and literature and visual art, and see the inner workings. So again, the students will try that gourmet, and perhaps then they will be able to differentiate and develop their own taste, because taste is something that needs to be cultivated. We're not born with taste, right? With taste with, let's say, sophisticated taste. It's somehow cultivated intentionally. I don't know, I don't want to sound elitist, but I find there is kind of good kind of elitism to strive for. Aesthetic elitism.
I think one area where classical, let's say Western classical music differs very much from pop music is that Western music, classical music, and by that I mean Baroque, classical, romantic, even quote unquote serious modernist music, tends to be teleological. That means that everything is constantly in flux, moving towards a goal of some kind or goals of some kind. So it's constantly metamorphosing from one level to another, from one, let's say, sentiment. This is the term that the 18th century theorists used, that it's modulating from one sentiment to another. It's always moving forward. It's always moving towards the goal. It's never static. It's always dynamic. Dynamism was the goal of these composers. So it's not like popular music where you have one backbeat, which, you know, constantly pulses through steadily through the composition. In classical music, there's a constant change, constant evolution, constant reaching back, reaching forward, moving forward, going to the next goal, searching for that telos.
I would say flamenco has the same kind of dynamism, for example. Won't you say so in a different way?
Maybe before going to flamenco, can I just interject just so the music as it developed post-tonal is less and less teleological. Would you agree with me on that?
No.
You don't agree? All right.
No.
So
in other words, I think that there's no less teleological elements in Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, and so on. Then there are, or Babbitt, than there is in, or Ferneyhough, than there is in, you know, classical music. That there's a constant motion towards goals.
Just different galaxy, we can say.
Yeah, it's a different galaxy, but the principles, the forces that are in play are the same. We don't reinvent the forces. Like I tell my students that Schoenberg didn't unscrew his ears like light bulbs, right? He didn't unscrew his old tonal ears at all. On the contrary, he said that my musical language is an outgrowth of tonal music. And in fact, if you look at the way Berg and Schoenberg and Webern taught, they insisted that all of their students get a firm grounding in tonal composition first, and counterpoint and harmony. And that way they learned about all these processes, these teleological large-scale processes, and then they could apply those in a post-tonal environment. But the processes themselves do not vanish. I can prove that. I mean, I can really prove it because I have the manuscripts of their students where they're actually doing these exercises, and then I can prove it with their early compositions and show how they matured. In other words, how they elaborated a basic framework, no less than a classical composer would, but they do it in a different way, that's all.
So I think we've made a huge progress in the conversation because we have come up, I'm not sure I agree, but you, Tim, came up with what I was asking for, i.e. a sort of a criterion for judging a music that has integrity and coherence and consistency. And this criterion is teleology, i.e. a form of purpose or finality and something that is moving toward. So from there, the question maybe for next encounter among us would be how to prove. First of all, no, the question would be why this criterion? Why would this criterion of teleology be privileged over non-teleological forms of arrangement or organization of sound and rhythms, for example? That would be, you know, another discussion, perhaps. Yes.
And I also want to add that it's not just moving toward, but moving from,
Okay.
which kind of puts us into some sort of historical, but also aesthetic continuum of things.
Mhm.
And I think that's very important in how we approach
Mhm.
music education or in academic education, the whole development, the evolutionary approach, if you will, of things. Even 20th century composers, they always looking back before they look forward. It's this past, present, future continuum I really would like to explore with Tim. And I think we almost cutting our umbilical cord off from historical continuum in many ways, historical aesthetic continuum. I don't know if I make sense.
Could I add one last thing here? And that is that I think the human spirit is always fighting against entropy.
Yeah.
That is dissolution.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of composers were fascinated with the opposite, that is, or both processes, let's say. First, the evolution of order out of chaos. Like, how do I take these disparate elements and make something organized, something ordered out of them? And that would become maybe the moment of the teleological, let's say, moment of maximal order. And then we have a devolution possibility. And other composers were, in fact, interested, as Ora just said, in maybe starting with order and then devolving. But that's much rarer in our tradition, I would say, in the Western tradition of classical music, that it's usually chaos to order. So if you want an example, look at the beginning of Haydn's creation, right? How does he, within his language, create this idea of chaos becoming order? And then if you want an example, I think, of devolution, that is, of descent from order into chaos. I think one composer who was kind of interested in that was Sibelius. So if you look at Sibelius's Fourth Symphony, the ending of that symphony, the way it devolves and just dissipates at the end, or perhaps even in a certain sense, the Farewell Symphony by Haydn, the last movement again, where the musicians put out their, gradually one by one, they snuff out their candles and they walk away. It's not just a question that they were upset that the prince wasn't giving them an overdue holiday. It's not, you see, again, that's the external stimulus. But Haydn was aiming at something bigger than that, you see? He was wondering about devolution. He was thinking about, how can I represent this dissipation of order in music?
Yeah, it reminds me of a very beautiful movie by Bela Tar. I don't know if you've seen this movie entitled now I forget the title, but it's about this horse that Nietzsche talked to at the end of his life. You know the title, maybe.
I
right?
don't. I forgot because you wanted me to see this movie.
That's
and
right.
I never
It's
did.
easy to find. So it's a very famous movie by Bela Tar. and it's about devolution. It's really about the de-creation or anti-creation. So the whole movie goes toward entropy, and to an extent, it is an experimental movie. And for me, there are lots of analogies between a movie like this and certain post-tonal works that are expressing vortex and entropy and chaos. And I'm thinking of Ligeti, for example, or Penderecki, for example. And so I think that there are classically trained composers out there in the 20th century and maybe today who are in search of this anti or counter creation and who are trying to go toward, it's after all, it's the whole theme of what Thomas Mann, Leverkusen, Dr. Faustus, yes, and so Leverkusen. So anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I would like also, the allusion came to mind, there is no poetry after Holocaust. That's another.
It's a whole different discussion. But
yes, but I would like to have that discussion because it somehow links to what we're talking about now. I call it the concept of anti-beauty. It's almost the other side of what we call aesthetics, the negative aesthetics, which I would love to have discussion about that.
I would like to add just one small thing, and that is that it's not just in 20th century music. As I said, you can find some few examples, but they are there, I think, in earlier periods as well. But it's much less common, of course. But it's there. It's remarkably there. So, and that reaches back to what I was saying about integrity. That always musicians and composers are conscious of the historical time and place in which they're working, and they do have certain strings attached. But the inner integrity to explore these issues is there throughout that. And that's why we remember their music. And that's why we cultivate it today, long after they're gone. And the issues which were important in their time are no longer a factor at all in our perceptions, right?
Wonderful. Well, for me, it was a delicious appetizer, this conversation, and I certainly hope you will agree. I have my cold tea here.
I have my wine here. So.
I would love us, after this appetizer or introduction or overture, to have a chance to continue this conversation, because I have thousands of questions bubbling in my mind to address with you two. And if you two agree, I would love to bring this conversation into more developing phase in maybe a couple of weeks or so, if you agree.
Maybe
I don't take no as an option.
Maybe it would be good to discuss a few specific pieces of music too.
Yeah.
From this perspective.
And
right?
I can illustrate stuff if
of
you want
course
me
you
to.
Could. Yes.
It would be great.
Maybe we could talk about some piano pieces by Chopin and Brahms. And
wonderful.
Schumann, maybe.
Yes.
Or Bach. And, I mean, anything. Have you ever played the Kunst der Fuge on the keyboard?
No.
Okay. Because I think that would be a very interesting discussion.
I can try. Give me homework.
There was there's a Russian pianist. You probably know her, Nikolaevna.
Yes.
She was a friend of Shostakovich. He wrote the preludes and fugues for her. I think her name is Tatiana. Yes. Amazing. She plays it all on the piano so beautifully. It's really amazing. If you could play some of that, it would be great, because I've studied it very deeply, and I think there are some things we could talk about there as well that would be really interesting. Again, there was no, I don't think extra, there was no commission that I know of. He wrote this from his inner impulses to demonstrate the art of fugue. There was no, I don't think he was paid to do that. He just wanted to do that. So the impulse is, again, this very idealistic, this very Platonic idea of demonstrating a pure idea and how it can be manifest in music. The same was true for the B minor Mass. I mean, I don't think there was ever even a performance during his lifetime, right? He created the B minor Mass simply as a spiritual exercise. But consider all the things that he went through to do that. I mean, he mined his own works. He recomposed some of the movements or recompositions from his cantatas. Like he went back to his cantatas and reworked certain passages in them to create this amazing unified self-referential Mass. You see, nobody paid him to do that. He never got a penny for it. There was no external impulse whatsoever.
Yeah, you say it beautifully, Tim. It's like, I wish we would remind ourselves to sing glory to irreducible creative spirit that cuts through everything.
Yeah.
And these great works of Bach, they are the testimonial of that.
Right. In my opinion, again, this is simply just an opinion, Bruno. There's no greater composer than J.S. Bach ever. Not Beethoven, not Mozart, not Mendelssohn. They're all great, of course, and each in a different way. But
I totally concur. I completely concur with you.
And I don't argue also.
I mean, it's just incredible. You see, if you look at Mozart's early music, it's really very close to his father's. It's good. The foundation is very good and very solid, but it's not great. It took him a while to really develop as a composer. I mean, if you look at his early music, it's okay. It's a little bit better than mediocre. But then there was a maturation process that took some time and real effort and internal wrestling with his angels before he really reached such a high level, right? And the same is true of Beethoven, less so, but still true. I mean, and not everything Beethoven did is great. Not everything. He can be quite, I think, at times uneven. So, I mean, every composer had his flaws, but if you look at Bach, I challenge you to find a weak piece by Bach. It's almost not there. I mean, it's just incredible that one man could have achieved such heights through so many works.
He just did not write them down.
And you know that we've lost 250 cantatas or 300 cantatas. We know of them by their text, but it boggles the mind. And then on top of that, to have produced 4 sons who were master composers, right? I mean, C.P. Bach, J.C. Bach, the other 2, I forget the initials right now, but they're all good composers. They're all better than good, all right? Really important composers. Friedrich Bach, Carl Friedrich Bach. And raised, I don't know how many of his kids, he used to take all of his children that lived, I guess, I don't know, 15 kids. Yeah. And they had their own orchestra, and they used to go around coffee houses and play as an orchestra. And he and his wives had trained all of them. They all had an incredible ability.
And he wouldn't forget to get drunk at least once a week in a tavern, right? With God knows how many cups of beers and sausage. So
Right. I mean, it boggles the mind how any one man could. I mean, you just look at the list of works, Bach's Werkverzeichnis. It's over 1,000 works. You know.
yeah. Well, Tim and Bruno, thank you for this incredibly uplifting appetizer conversation. And
Thank
to
you.
be
Thank you.
continued. I'll see you soon, and I will roll my sleeves and get to fugue. Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye, team.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye, Aura.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Aura.
Bye.